Coin, if Edgar Allan Poe had remained in the service, can you picture Appomattox and Robert E. Lee surrendering to Lieutenant General Edgar Allan Poe? It's a scene that is so bizarre, I think it's worth a story by Edgar Allan Poe. I didn't make you laugh, that's a shame. I will try again later. In fact, very soon. Because I want to talk about Mark Twain. You know, Mark Twain published the memoirs, or will, in a few months. He came here as a visitor. And Mr. Twain, America's great funny man, was all business while he was here. All business. I didn't see him crack a smile. I did notice, you know Mark Twain, very, very tall, almost like Ichabod Crane, skinny, with hair going in all directions, and a great mustache going in all directions. He walked down from the hotel, and General Grant's granddaughter, his 9-year-old granddaughter, was playing here on the lawn. He came walking along the path. She turned around, saw this great, odd-looking creature, and she ran into the cottage screaming, "A madman is outside, a madman!" That's not why I wanted to make you laugh, but I thought that was a good story. What you may not know is at the start of the Civil War, Mark Twain, who was still Samuel Clemens then, for a little while was in a Confederate militia group called the Marion Rangers for Marion County, Missouri. And what you may not know is that at the start of the Civil War, Grant, who had been a civilian for many years, was reinstated as the colonel of one regiment. Not a great army, not all our armies, one regiment from Illinois. I think it was the 21st Illinois. And that regiment's very first assignment was to go to Marion County, Missouri, and look for rebels. Mark Twain's little group was very smart. They knew that their job was to stay out of the way of the Yankees. So they just dodged and evaded, and in the end there was never any conflict, any skirmish between the two groups. But what if the 21st Illinois and the Marion Rangers had skirmished, and Samuel Clemens had died in battle? Or, conversely, Colonel Grant had died in battle? Or both in the same fight? We might have lost America's greatest author and his greatest military man. These what-ifs, well, they fascinate me. But one thing I do know, although these brilliant men were spared and gave us great gifts in their own special ways, so many of those who died in the war were equally brilliant, equally gifted, and they could have made our country a better place too. It is one of the, to me, one of the greatest tragedies of any war is that we honestly don't know how much they cost. But I swear to you, we lost so many gifted writers in the wilderness and Spotsylvania and Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Men who never had the chance to write. Men who never had the chance to play music that would have made us weep from its beauty. Men who would have been decent political leaders with vision, like Lincoln. They died, they never came home. I think General Grant knew very well that he was meant to be those fallen men's voice in this world. He tried to be the most decent man he could be at all times, the most decent politician at all times. And I think it was his way of honoring those fallen, anonymous soldiers who had never gotten home, who had never been given the chance to live life as they should have had. Well, I can't really be coherent about this because I was in Virginia and I saw it. One of the visitors here was Charles Wood, a local man from Troy, New York, actually Lansingburg, and his story is very unusual. You know what brought on the Grant tragedy? Early last year, the president of his bank absconded with all their money. They were flat broke. And so the general started writing his memoirs in the hope that if he could finish them, which he did just 3 days before he died, he finished them right here. His hope was that his book would sell and save, but to recoup the family fortune is what I'm trying to say. But midway through the process, as he was working on his book, he was stricken with cancer. It was terminal, and overnight General Grant knew he was a dying man. So finishing the book became critical, and that was his last battle here. But before that last battle was fought, all that America knew was that the Grants were broke. And many people wanted to help the family. They offered General Grant tons of money, I suppose. But General Grant and Mrs. Grant were so proud and such dignified people, they would not accept charity. That was out of the question. It took a perfect stranger, Charles Wood of Troy, New York, to understand the right approach. This total stranger sent in the mail to General Grant 2 checks for $1,500. But he didn't say, I give these to you in your hour of need. He said, these are a loan. A loan the general would accept, because that meant he was expected to repay it, and that is what proper human beings do. They do not accept charity, but if they accept loans, they are honor bound to repay them. Charles Wood figured out how to help the Grants when they were penniless. With one of those checks, he included a note which read, I owe you this for Appomattox, which is rather enigmatic. Nobody quite knew what that meant. But when the general and his family were here, Mr. Wood was invited up to the cottage. They sat on the porch. Now, I only heard Mr. Wood's part of the conversation because the general couldn't speak. He was writing little notes in reaction to what Mr. Wood had to say. Clearly, the general asked, what did you mean by, I owe you this for Appomattox? And Mr. Wood told him the story. Mr. Wood did not serve in the Army during the war. He was a businessman. His company in Troy had large government contracts. He felt he must stay to oversee the fulfilling of those contracts. But he had 2 brothers that did serve. They were in a cavalry unit, actually. Let's see, what cavalry unit was it? Perhaps I don't have the cavalry unit written down, but the point is, the 2 brothers, I remember their names, Artemus and George. George was horrifically wounded at Winchester in the Shenandoah Valley in 1864. He didn't make it home, but his brother did. And what Mr. Wood meant by, I owe you this for Appomattox, was this. It was his belief that if General Grant had not ended the war when and how he did, he would have lost his other brother as well. We come back to Appomattox again and again. Mr. Wood and others believed that if Grant had said to the rebels, you are our prisoners, some of you will hang, some of you will be imprisoned for years, Lee's army would have melted away during the night and formed 100 little guerrilla bands that would have kept the war going for another 5 or 10 years. And Mr. Wood was convinced that if that had happened, he would have lost his other brother as well. So when he said, I owe you this for Appomattox, he was saying something I've already said. That General Grant made the rebels made them believe that we in the North would not penalize them, would not harm them if they kept the peace, The compassion that Grant extended made all the difference. In 1 million homes around this country, soldiers that would have died had the war continued did not die. They got home to their families. Fathers, husbands, brothers, they got home. And Mr. Wood was saying, thank you. Thank you. Well, when General Grant heard that explanation, he wrote a little note, which Mr. Wood shared with me after the general left the porch. Mr. Wood said that he would save this note for the rest of his life, and I believe that he will. The note read, General Grant writing to Mr. Wood, while there is much unblushing wickedness in the world, there is also a certain grandeur of the soul. General Grant was paying a compliment to Mr. Wood, saying that he had a grand soul. Mr. Wood knew full well that it was General Grant who carried the greater soul. General Grant, by the way, did repay that loan. And Mr. Wood here on the porch said, General, I didn't want the money back. You know that. General just waved him off. He said, General, you sent the money back to me, the $1,500. I want to tell you what I've done with it. I've divided it in half. And I've sent half of the money to a charity in New York, and the other half to Charleston, South Carolina. There's been a great earthquake there this year. They're rebuilding the city. I'm sending the money equally to both sections of the country. And I could see by the general's expression he believed that was the best use that money could be put to. Finally, one more visitor. We expect Union soldiers and their families to flock here, and that indeed has happened. But one of the visitors here in the general's last days was a former Confederate general, Simon Bolivar Buckner. Like so many of the officers in the Civil War, before the war broke out, men who went with the North, men who went with the South, were cadets together and had served in Mexico together. And this was the case with Simon Buckner. He and Grant had been at West Point, served together in the Mexican War. They were good friends before the war. But then Buckner went with his native state of Kentucky, and Grant, as you know, got command of an Illinois regiment. In the beginning of the war, things went badly for the Union. We were winning nothing. But finally, in February 1862, there were victories, 2 victories, back to back, 10 days apart, in Tennessee. Forts Henry and Donelson surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. This was electrifying. This country needed victories, and Grant gave us victories. The Confederate officer who surrendered Fort Donelson was Simon Buckner. Now, after the war, General Grant picked up where he had left off with old friends. It did not matter if they had served the Confederacy. And one such was Simon Buckner. They stayed friends all those years after the war. General Buckner was widowed a few years ago, recently remarried, and earlier this year he and his new bride were honeymooning near here, I think maybe in Saratoga, and they heard that the general was here, and they heard of his very dire condition. And so Mr. and Mrs. Buckner came here, and of course they were admitted to the cottage immediately. It was a private meeting. When General Buckner came out, you could see he was shaken. He was pale. He'd been crying, this old soldier. And there were reporters here. They'd been hovering around us like hummingbirds around a bird feeder all summer, waiting for the cataclysmic news that the general was dead. But he wasn't dead yet. So the reporters asked General Buckner, what did General Grant say to you? What did you say to him? And Buckner began by saying, "My first mission was to tell my friend Grant that we in the South, we old soldiers, we've come to love and respect him, each and every one of us. That for us, the war really is over. We remember the respect with which he treated us at Appomattox. And we remember when Grant's bluff was called by President Johnson, the man who had replaced Abraham Lincoln. President Johnson wanted to put on trial for treason Robert E. Lee, and Jefferson Davis, and James Longstreet, leaders of the Confederacy. President Johnson was going to do that, going to put them on trial for treason. And Ulysses S. Grant walked into the president's office and sat down and said, "Mr. President, you cannot do that. I gave these men my sacred pledge that if they went home and kept the peace, they would not be molested. They would not be harmed. And they have kept their part of the bargain. They have kept the peace. And if you persist, if you are determined to try them for treason, I will resign from the army right now, and I will go up and down this country denouncing you as an enemy to peace." Do you want to see Ulysses S. Grant giving speeches like that? President Johnson did not. And so he dropped the idea of trying the old Confederate leaders for treason, making the healing of this country possible. And Buckner was telling Grant that the South remembered that and loved him for what he had done. And then Mr. Buckner shared with the reporters a note that General Grant had written to him, because the general couldn't speak. And the note read in part, this is General Grant speaking to a former Confederate general. The note read in part, "I have witnessed since my sickness just what I have always wished to see ever since the war. Harmony between North and South. I have always contended that had it been left to the soldiers, we would have had peace within a year." Well, it has been a generation since the war ended. And I hear that today in New York, when the General Grant's body is placed in the tomb, Simon Buckner and other Confederate generals, Joseph Johnston being one, will be among the pallbearers. His old foes have embraced this man. They know that when the general wrote about the grandeur of the human soul, he might as well have been writing about himself. But he was too modest a man to think in those terms. But all these people that came to this cottage, they recognized him. And think about the diversity of men who came here. Men who would never have met otherwise, except for one thing: their love and respect for Ulysses S. Grant. Let me just go down that list one more time. Governor Samuel Pingree, soldier, Union veteran, war hero. General Grant's cook, a former slave. Matthias Romero, a Mexican patriot who recognized in Grant another patriot of the purest heart. Dr. John Gray, a healer who recognized in Grant a fellow healer. Judge Hilton, who came here asking for forgiveness and received it. Father Didier, who came here for reconciliation and found General Grant eager for reconciliation. Mark Twain, what can I say of Mark Twain? There's so many facets to his personality. Mark Twain said to a reporter after the general's death, "Ulysses S. Grant was one of the greatest men I ever knew, and one of the best And you know Mark Twain. He's a man of sarcasm. He's a man of harsh judgments. But he came to see, I think, General Grant as almost a father. Charles Wood, the businessman, in his helping General Grant at the time of his great need, he gave to General Grant compassion, not money. He gave him compassion, which is just the example Grant gave us at Appomattox. And Simon Buckner, coming here, combining all of those things. Simon Buckner, speaking of national reconciliation, healing, forgiveness, compassion, and finally, peacemaking. General Grant was a great warrior, but he was a better peacemaker in my view. And I'm told that over his tomb in New York will be these words: "Let us have peace." We're going to close our commemoration with Amazing Grace. It is a song, perhaps you don't know this, that was written by a man who had been a slaver, a man who made his living in the slave trade, and finally realized that his own soul was being corrupted by that evil. And he wrote Amazing Grace to ask God to forgive him. And I think he also wrote Amazing Grace because all of us feel that we have failed. I don't know in what terms, often morally, ethically. We want to be forgiven. So I think this song not only helped this former evil man regain some degree of self-love, but it has helped us, I think, in our times of trial, begin to love ourselves again as well. Amazing Grace.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils and snares, I have already proved 'tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be, as long as life endures. Yea, when this flesh and heart shall fail, and mortal life shall cease, I shall possess within the veil a life of joy and peace.
Thank you. Tours of the cottage will begin soon. Samantha, I don't know if you have any words about how to organize tours with a crowd this large.
Who wants to do a tour? We're meeting at the front of the porch, so join us over there and then we'll figure it all out.
Okay.